Today we're getting into some old school strength work. And I mean, it's always a part of my training these days anyway, but I do specifically have a day where I go in and just like really tackle components of those things that are more heavy in my training. When I talk about old school strength, it's that discussion around the Bronze era, because to me, the Bronze era is where all the gold is that I think a lot of us are looking for. Like when I even got into training, like when I was younger, I wanted that, like, you know, that athletic, strong, old school physique. And those athletes trained in like the most unique way, and none of these training principles are present anymore, because I mean, the fitness industry is just blown up to this level that we all feel like we have to train a certain way to get a certain type of result. And even if some of the unconventional things that they did back then, if for whatever reason at one point were thought to be unsafe, with a lot of the recent research that's come out now about how the spine moves and knees over the toes, you know, ranges of motion, there's really no evidence to suggest that their training principles are deemed unsafe if the proper approach progressively was taken to get strong like that. So I mean, there's so much gold in it, and so we're going to dive into some of that today. And when I talk about the Bronze era specifically, we're looking at early 1900s to the 1930s. Like that was really when it was like booming. Performing strongman was becoming a thing. The barbell was becoming popularized by a lot of these strength athletes. Dumbbells. The application of strength training and physical culture was really growing, and it was really growing around their styles of training. Specifically, like what they did back then that you just don't see anymore, they did heavy movements and heavy lifts with one hand. And I think really if you were to just isolate the Bronze era application of training down to one thing, and you wanted to use that in your training, just do that. Start lifting heavy shit with one hand. So like even at a competitive level, they would compete in a lot of the Olympic lifts that you see now, but with one hand. So they would do like a one-hand snatch, one-hand clean and jerks, one-hand deadlifting, like all of these different variations. We're gonna get into a look at some of these today, but that's really like the piece that just isn't applied in that kind of way anymore, like lifting, doing heavy lifts with one hand and getting crazy strong in that one hand type approach. I'm excited to share with you a deep look into a training session that is heavily evolved around a lot of these training principles, and just show you how I've used these things and talk a little bit more around that approach to training. Yeah, let's get into it. Dumbbell swing is old school. You don't see the dumbbell swing being done anymore. And it was like one of the key lifts back then. The biggest dumbbell swing of all time right now is 100 kilos, 220 pounds. So that was Herman Goyner. Swung 100 kilos in one arm overhead. So that's what we're gonna get into today as a warm-up, is just some of that old school dumbbell swinging. So this is a 15-pound dumbbell. And then, yeah, we're gonna add some plates to it. So with the dumbbell swing, it's basically taking that pendulum type movement and going right overhead with it. To the technique with it, they would actually dip under it, kind of like the way we dip under a snatch or like an Olympic lift. Like they would swing like that. So they wouldn't just hinge and throw the weight up. They would actually get some momentum, and when they would ready, they would actually dip underneath the weight, similar to some of those other type movements. So I'm going to do my best to replicate that, but just show you how I've been doing it and using it in technique. So with the loadable dumbbell, what you can also get into is kind of setting the plates up the way it was set up back then as well too. So it's kind of like behind the body, and what we're doing is allowing the weight to start from a position of momentum. Where it's positioned behind me, it'll actually create some momentum already to start moving in that pendulum shape. So all in one action or in 2 or 3 actions, creating some swing first to get more momentum to then drop under the weight. So what you can actually see from this side is
I am going to be pressing down on my other leg. So that's actually going to allow me to generate more strength as the weight gets heavier. So I'm don't need to necessarily do it right now with this weight, but I'm warming that up. A lot of these one-hand old-time lifts, that was what it was about. Understanding technique is like, how can I use my whole body to move as much weight as possible with one hand? It's not necessarily unilateral in that we're trying to figure out how to generate as much strength from the whole body. So that was one thing you'll see a lot of the old-time images when they're pressing down on the thigh. They're generating that torque and as much force as possible to just produce that strength. So I'm kind of dipping under it there, but another one that you can do as well is kind of move into a split stance. So as you come overhead, you could be stepping forward. That's another way that they would do it. So I'll do a few of those too to show you. So I'll add some weight. Not sponsored by Rogue or anything, but I am using the Rogue DB15, and these aluminum collars are actually super strong. I've been using them for Steinborn lifts as well, like tipping the bar over. I get up to about 140 kilos on those tips. So I mean, these have been very durable and strong for that. I've been finding with the back hang, now I have to move my hand back towards the heavier side, because the other way you can do it that I've also been shown as well is if you have the weight evenly distributed, you can kind of move to the front and anchor your wrist into the dumbbell, which works quite well. But now if you do the back hang technique, it sucks because as you start to swing, the heavier side is just like you can't manage it. So I have had to move my hand back further to perform a back hang. One thing you will notice, like what I'm actually trying to do on the old time swing is get under the weight. Whereas like when you perform like a kettlebell swing or a traditional swing, you're basically just hinging and extending your hips and staying tall. So it's all hinge. This is a little bit more like an Olympic lift where you're actually vertical. So I'm actually vertical, and as I swing, I'm trying to dip under the weight and stay in this vertical position. So it's a little more awkward to learn the old technique, like the way they used to do it back then. It's pretty crazy. What I'm doing right now, warming up, is just dipping under the weight. But now as you start to get heavier, you can think about creating an initial swing to get more momentum to then backswing again and get under the weight faster. So I'll try that now with this weight. Yeah, we'll have to attach a picture of Arthur Saxon. It's like probably the best picture of him doing a dumbbell swing. He's like this, and it looks like there's a billion pounds on the dumbbell. It's like such a big, massive dumbbell. Saxon had a big swing too. I think he swung 85 kilos, 187 pounds overhead, but he had the biggest bent press. So again, we're talking about the era of one arm, one hand strength. The bent press was the lift where you would move underneath the weight and lock the weight out, and he had the biggest one. I think the official is 371 pounds. That's like 168 kilos, so he would just, in one hand. That's more than most people squat or deadlift. It was insane. I think he had a 400-pound bent press, unofficial. It's documented, but it was like an unofficial record. 400 pounds. That's insane. Like 300 pounds on a bent press. And it's just, the mobility is insane to move under the weight. And that's probably why I think a lot of this stuff got lost. The demands of the mobility required to perform a lot of those movements. That's the thing too, man. Like I don't think you should ever just like adopt one technique. And when you read about these old time approaches, like when you read their books and stuff too, they were so open-minded about technique. Like, yeah, there's like best way of doing things, but there's multiple ways of doing it really well that people have had success with. Play with it and figure out what works best for you. Like that's such a big message for people that want to get strong, is like, don't get caught up in one way of doing things, because there's a shitload of ways to get strong. And another reason why Bronze era strength is just like full of gold for someone that wants to get strong, and that's been following the systematic Bulgarian style approach to training that derives from Olympic level champions that were on a lot of drugs. So everyone's training like these people and wondering why they're fucking trashed all the time. It's like, you got to get into some unconventional things, right? Like strength is strength. Like you're going to get strong. And I've been seeing carryover into those traditional lifts with this stuff, man. My deadlift has been going through the roof, and I'm not a deadlifter. Maybe I am. I just sucked at it. But just getting unconventionally strong in my pulling strength with some of these old lifts, it's just been a game changer, man. I'm 38. It's like, I'm still getting strong. That's unheard of. Or it's expected that I'm not supposed to be for whatever reason. Fuck them. Just testing the waters to see what it feels like to pull from the deficit. Same thing on the one-hand deadlift technique. You're still leveraging your other side. And what they used to do is they would actually, like when they would do it from the ground, they would just pull so the bar was balanced just above the knee. Moving any higher than that actually tends to tip the bar. That's why you do see, and it's actually in the rules for USAWA, is that the bar just has to be above the knee. So you actually end up in this like slightly slouched forward posture rather than like when you deadlift, you come up like this. Well, again, what's cool about that, right? Like what does that offer us? It actually keeps us in rotation. So now you're training this next level of rotation strength. The lats just get trained like crazy. Like I've heavy one-hand deadlifts. I've never had my lats and obliques cramp up like that. You know, even like someone struggling with lat engagement on their deadlift, like if they thought that was an issue or if that was an issue, some heavy one-hand deadlifts, I mean, that's gonna lock you in for sure. Like it's gonna make you figure out how to use those lats when you're pulling. So. You want to go one plate, two plate, whatever, like you do when you do traditional deadlifts, but you got to remember you're pulling with one arm. So putting 2 plates on is like a 100-pound jump in your one arm. When you do start getting into that Bronze Era strength, their approaches and like how they did things, and it was like a certain mentality of training. How do we get stronger in different ways? And I mean, that's why the USAWA, I keep referring to them because they still compete in a lot of lifts that they did back then. I've been doing them. They've been letting me do some of their meets online, and they call it all around weightlifting. So the idea there is that as a weightlifter or strength enthusiast, you have the capacity to be all around. So you can show up one day, you can squat, you can dumbbell swing, you can zercher lift, you can one-hand deadlift, you can do all those lifts. So it's about the diversity of your strength, not just your ability to do 3 lifts. So it's a cool way of thinking. And I think if a lot of us thought that way, we would be more excited about strength training. Old school Bronze Era strength, it's literally just about like how many fucking weird ways can you be strong. It feels all right, actually. I get a lot more leg drive. I mean, to me, like the conversation we had earlier about like how does one start, right? Because you get into it and you're like excited, and the exciting ones are like bench press, right? Dumbbell swing, like these a little more advanced kind of lifts. Like it takes a little bit more skill. This isn't very advanced, really. Like it's the one-hand deadlift, and I mean, the cool thing about a one-hand lift like this, I'm doing straddle. I could go front. I could go suitcase. I could go hack lift. Jefferson. You can turn any deadlift variation into a one-hand deadlift, which is like, I mean, again, opportunities that lie in your strength potential. So like, if you want to get started incorporating some Bronze Era strength in your training, start doing one-hand deadlifts of variations. Straddle, this is like the most old school traditional approach, and you'll be able to load up quite heavily. And again, think about that, like my max deadlift right now is 500 pounds, conventional. So I pulled 330 in my left, 315 in my right, pounds. Think about the potential you leave on the table with how much weight you can load into one side of the body versus your double hand lift. Creating more opportunities to get strong. That's all strength training is. I don't know. What ends up happening though is like right away as you start getting into your heavier lifts, like with the one hand, it's the balance in the hands, like trying to keep the bar balanced and like where your hand is. So that's what I'm doing at the start. I'm actually checking the balance with two hands. So you set where you think is centered, and you just come under to test the bar with the other hand and check your balance, because just the slightest shift will tip the weight that way or tip the weight this way. And my left compared to my right is different, feels different. And even if it's a matter of like where your grip strength is weak. So don't just say your grip strength's weak, like where is it weak? Like as you're pulling, if you're letting go of the front, you gotta like think about how strong you need to be there, radial, ulnar deviation, like all this stuff comes into play now that you just don't ever think about. You're like, fuck, it's like, this is a whole different capacity of strength. Let's go. All right.